we've got breaking news.
Breaking news.
Sergio Perez and Red Bull have reached an agreement to part ways with immediate effect. Earlier this year, Perez signed a deal to race for the team until the end of 2026 on the back of his strongest season in 2023, where he finished second to his teammate and champion Max Verstappen. However, his form has tailed off this season since signing that deal, and he scored just 9 points in the last 8 Grand Prix weekends of the season. Throughout this difficult period, Sergio Perez has remained resolute that he would race for the team next year, but following discussions with Red Bull, they've agreed to split after 4 years together. Sam, this has been somewhat drawn out because I think this has been on the cards for a little while. As mentioned, Perez has been quite resolute throughout this that he would be returning next year, but I think his confidence in that started to wane when we got to the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. We know that they had a shareholders meeting directly after that Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. And then, of course, the news now that he won't be racing for the team next year. Your immediate reaction to the news?
Not shocked. Shocked at the timing of the announcement. I thought it'd either come straight after that kind of shareholders meeting that we saw straight after the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, or they would wait until the new year, which we discussed, I think, on a Patreon episode really recently, that would be kind of when it would be announced, if it ever came. And we kind of almost said, at this point, no news for Sergio Perez is good news. But because of that gap, I'm still not shocked. I'm still not surprised that this has been the decision. We've been calling for this for a lot of the season. He started the season particularly well. He picked up 3 second places, all behind Max Verstappen when Verstappen won. The one that he didn't pick up in those first 4 Grand Prix was Australia, where you'll remember Max Verstappen had a DNF. I think Sergio Perez finished 5th in that Grand Prix. So the Red Bull not looking strong there either. But after that point, it really went downhill for Sergio Perez. There were talks about him being replaced by Daniel Ricciardo in the summer break, you'll remember. That never materialized. And then Liam Lawson stepped in for Daniel Ricciardo, and he was ousted in Singapore from the RBC, the junior program. And now the conversations are that Lawson may be the one to replace Sergio Perez after his removal. He's not been on his best form. Sergio Perez has had a glowing career. And I really stand by the fact that he was, much like what Hulkenberg did this season, he was kind of the leader of the midfield for so many years previously to his move to Red Bull. And that's why he got that move to Red Bull. After Red Bull had so many poor choices with their second driver or not allowing enough time, you remember both Gasly and Albon and Kvyat were all kicked off the seat very quickly due to a run of poor performances when they were very low on experience. Sergio Perez was the man they turned to fill that seat. He picked up that brilliant wing in Bahrain in the Racing Point. And seasons before this, he was regularly the guy that outperformed, picking up podiums in the Force India as it was back then the Racing Point. He always excelled. He was Mr. Consistent. He was known as the tyre whisperer for a reason. So to see him have such a fall in form and in ability in this Red Bull maybe speaks to the fact that it follows the trend of the car being built very much to suit Max Verstappen. And again, that does make sense. It makes sense to build the car for your number one driver. Verstappen makes it work. He wins titles. But the car is built in such a specific way that maybe it doesn't suit any other driver's driving style. We're seeing that negative effect. Nonetheless, we don't know to what extent that ability has been hampered by Perez's driving a car in a different style. He hasn't been up to scratch. He's half the points that Verstappen has managed. He was the only driver in the top 8 to not pick up a race win. And fundamentally, he is the reason that Red Bull did not win the Constructors' title this season and actually ended up finishing 3rd. So as much as he's had a fantastic build-up to this point, the last year or so where he's only led 1 lap in the last 12 months really has been the cause of why he's been kicked out of that seat. So it's going to be sad that he's no longer on the grid anymore, and maybe he'll find his way back in the likes of a Cadillac or something else in years to come. But for now, we're going to have a season without him, and I do think it's the right call. I do think now is the time for Red Bull to move on from Sergio Perez.
I think Perez has been somewhat helped this season and potentially last season as well, in that Red Bull have failed to develop an alternative option. And I still believe that's true, regardless of whether they do go with Liam Lawson or Yuki Tsunoda. I'm not, and I don't think Red Bull are particularly thrilled by either option. It's not like when Verstappen came into the team that they had an obvious next person up. I think Sonoda's had a good season-ish. I think Lawson has shown some potential, but I don't think either option is what they had in mind a few years ago when they brought Sergio Perez in. Remember, when Perez joined the team, it was rather unusual for them to look outside of the Red Bull program, to the point where I think it was always intended to be a short to medium-term deal for them to develop the next Verstappen, or at least the next Ricciardo or the next Vettel, someone who could come into the team and really be a solid teammate to Verstappen. And Perez, who of course was much older than the average person that would go into the Red Bull program, could just do a job until he's no longer needed. And that isn't how this has worked out, I don't think. Perez has been moved on through his own poor performances throughout this season without there really being an obvious successor. I think we've mentioned it before that if Ricciardo had been good enough this season, he probably would have been a contender for that seat. Certainly, if Tsunoda, Lawson, De Vries last year, if any of these drivers had shown more early on in their AlphaTauri/RB careers, it might not have waited this long. But the fact that they've made this call, even without that next obvious person up, tells you everything you need to know about how much Perez did struggle throughout this season. They would have had to, Red Bull would have had to really move mountains to make this happen, because it's not like it got to the end of his contract. He had 2 full years on his contract to serve in 2025 and 2026. I don't even want to guess the amount of money they would have lost as a result of making the call to terminate this as early as they have. And that's not even including the amount of sponsorship that they will probably lose. And F1 generally will struggle with him not being there anymore. So this was a massively detrimental decision to their financial status, Red Bull. And I understand why they waited until this point, because you want to be confident of whoever's next up, and I don't think they are confident. I don't think they are confident with Lawson if they go with him. I don't think they're confident with Tsunoda either. So we'll wait to see how that decision is handled. But I can understand why. But the future, I think Red Bull have failed, quite simply put. I think Red Bull have failed in what they've tried to do with the advantage of having a second team. And this is the result of that failure.
I think you're very right to call that out. I think historically, the failure of what we see with Sergio Perez right now goes back years because of Red Bull's failures previously. Ricciardo was, at his prime, of course, in that 2018, 2017 period, sublime, absolutely incredible. We were touting him as the next world champion. He had multiple race wins, 8 to his name, I think 7 before he obviously left Red Bull, picked up 1 with McLaren, of course, at Monza. The performances that he was able to execute in the car that suited him, and you saw how close Ricciardo and Verstappen were when they were there together as teammates. It was silly to lose him. It was silly to not do more to keep him, because at that point he excelled, and arguably his form would have been much better staying at that Red Bull for the next 4 or 5 seasons than it would going through, the difficulties at Renault, moving to a team like McLaren, leaving the sport, coming back in at the junior team of RB. We probably would have seen a different Ricciardo, one that probably could do a fantastic job in supporting Max Verstappen, or arguably challenging Max Verstappen. And that's where the failures started to come about, that has led to, in the long term, the meme that you push one domino and it leads to Sergio Perez's kind of fall down in about 10 years' time. That's what began it, was the forgetting how good Ricciardo was for you. Because then we get the promotions of the likes of, the Kvyats, your Albons, your Gaslys, who you don't give enough time to. Yes, they're subpar. Yes, their performances are not good enough at the time, but they barely get a year to a season and a half in that seat, in a time where your car wasn't able to really win too many times either, and they're kicked out so quickly. And then Red Bull make what I think is the biggest wrong decision, and they hire Nick De Vries based on a one performance in favourable conditions, in a car that is suitable to that racetrack in Monza, off the back of him having a terrible Formula E defence. And he's just scooped up because they panicked. They don't know what to do with themselves, and they've gone, this will work. And that was a road decision from RB, and they don't prioritise their young drivers. They don't prioritise the development, all the money and effort they spent into this. They go external, and they don't give time when they should give time. And then they move forward, and Perez gets that seat, of course. And you look at the drivers that are coming out of the system since that's happened, and no one is set up properly. No one is given the time and the talent and the nurturing to be the next Ricardo of the second driver of 2017, 2018, or the next Vettel, or the next Verstappen, Ben, as you've mentioned. There is a fundamental fall down from what Red Bull have done in their hierarchy of drivers, and they have not given justice to any of these young drivers whatsoever. I'd be a little bit worried if I was Hajar or someone like that coming through, because you think, am I going to get the prioritization? Am I going to get the time? Do I get what I deserve coming through here after being a part of this program? Tsunoda is possibly about to be looked over. Lawson, maybe he gets the drive. We don't know yet at this point of recording. It doesn't feel confident either way. And the fact we're not sitting here going, it should be X and they will do a good job, or give them a year and they're going to be smashing it, is a worrying sign for a team like Red Bull, who are going to want to carry on competing and beating McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes, and others.
Was there a particular point this season where the situation became untenable between Perez and Red Bull, or was it more a combination of the lack of results in the second half of the season?
It was definitely the early mid part of the season for me that really cemented where I thought we were going. I've always thought from the start of the year that when we got that announcement that that Sergio had been given that multi-year deal and not just a one-year extension for 2024, and they'd review at the end of the season, I was always skeptical. And actually, like I've mentioned, he started the season really, really well. If you look at our power rankings on Patreon, 3 of the first 4 Grand Prix, I give him an 8 out of 10. He's done a really solid job. Australia, I give him a 4 because he does finish behind all of his rivals, essentially, apart from Verstappen, as I mentioned, who DNF'd. But it was when we got to the run of Emilia-Romagna, Imola, Monaco, Canada, Spain, and Austria. And you can throw Britain into there as well, where for me, he doesn't score higher than a 3 in our power rankings ratings. He is consistently off the pace. His qualifying has fundamentally always been poor in that Red Bull car, and no more so than this season, where it was almost a running joke of, will Perez qualify outside the top 10? Can't wait to see Perez getting knocked out in Q2 again. It became the shock that he got into Q3, and it was in that period where that really, truly began. His qualifying meant that it was always so much harder for him to ever score solid points or beat rivals around him, because he was starting 5-10 positions back so regularly from where they were. And I've already mentioned the statistic that he's the only one of those top 8 to not win a Grand Prix. It just was always evident. There was never one moment where it seemed to fall down a hill or fall off a cliff for him. He was just never really up to the point that was worthy of a second driver to Max Verstappen. And that's a tough order for anyone. That is a tall order for any driver to be alongside Max Verstappen. But it's very clear that the way the car is built, his driving style, and I just think his overall ability just weren't able to match up to what Red Bull were expecting this season.
And that's something Red Bull have to look at. They have to look at going into next season, is that the way that they set this car up for Verstappen is clearly not working for his teammates. And I use the plural on that because Perez is included, but so was Gasly and so was Albon. They have not been able to crack this, and it's cost them this year. It's cost them a Constructors' Championship. Now, of course, Perez did enough in that second seat in 22 and 23 to win the Constructors' Championship, but I think we were all sceptical of when that car had more competition, whenever that might be, maybe they would be in more trouble. And whether they need to reassess, whether they can find another driver who races in a similar way to Verstappen, whether they make some compromises on the car, whatever it might be, it's something they need to solve, and it's something they need to solve quite quickly as well. I do think it was salvageable for Perez a bit later on. I think whilst the mid-season was tricky for him, that wouldn't be the first time that the mid-season has been tricky for him. It's generally been where he struggled for this Red Bull team. But it's the fact that there was no bounce back in the later parts of this season, and in many respects, I think it got worse. So I think his home race might have been, for me, the one that really clenched it of, I don't know if there's any going back from this, even without another suitable candidate. That was maybe the low point for me. But
Baku was a real problem because he was faster than Max Verstappen that race weekend. And the fact that that's ending up with him and Carlos Sainz in the wall, and there's still no real blame placed on that. They're both kind of going in a straight line, but not really going in a straight line. You remember coming out of turn 2. That ruined his Grand Prix. And arguably, he may have gone on to be a contender for that race win, if not second place, and it would have been his best result since the fourth race of the season. That was pretty much, if you're not going to get it right here, where you're comfortable, where you've won before, where are you going to get it right?
I don't think the result mattered too much for Baku, because Red Bull would have seen the pace that he had there, and if he could have extended that form on for a couple of Grand Prix, regardless of whether he ends up winning the race or finishes on the podium or just off the podium, that I think that might have been enough to save him. So the fact that he retired from that Grand Prix, didn't score them any points, I don't think will have affected them too much. I think it's just the fact that it was a complete standalone performance in the second half of the season, and it couldn't be built on any other racetracks where he has struggled at. We know he does well at Baku, we know he does well at Saudi Arabia and some of these other tracks, but there are many more tracks that he seems to struggle at, or had struggled at in that Red Bull, that he couldn't turn around in 24, which I think really hurt him.
Collectively, as an average between the three of us, obviously Harry included in this, we scored him at Mexico an average of 0.7 out of 10.
It's not a very high number.
It's quite a low number. Tough one to swallow.
Last question on this one. How do you think Red Bull will reflect on the last 4 years of having Sergio Perez in that seat? As mentioned, it obviously hasn't been enough to grant him that fifth and that sixth year that was expected when he signed that contract, but equally, Perez has been that second driver where they've won 2 Constructors' Championships. Perez has won 5 races for the team. Will they look back at these 4 years fondly? Will they look at it as for areas of improvement? What do you think?
It's going to be tough. I'd like to think that Red Bull can learn from this, but we've seen so many times with their decisions in this second driver department that they don't seem to learn from this. They seem to be too rash in one instance where it's very clear that a driver deserves more time. Gasly, Albon, I'm putting in those 2 departments. And equally, there have been some real glaring moments where drivers like Sergio Perez, as much as historically they're a very solid driver, they probably should have been shown the door slightly earlier and maybe more time given to their development program. So the likes of Yuki Tsunoda, where half a season in the Red Bull, where there was nothing really to lose because you were already falling behind in the constructors, maybe would have been worth the risk at that point to see if a driver was able to pick up. I think what's frustrating is Perez is kind of 2 for 2. He's lost them 2 constructors, and he's, like I say, won them 2 constructors, but he's been useful in the other 2 constructors. Of course, 2023, Max Verstappen was winning that on his own regardless. 2022, Perez was useful. He had a good season, 21. And of course, this season, he was essentially the reason they don't go on to win those 2 constructors titles. And that means they've lost 2 championships because of one driver's performances. Hopefully they'll look back. And I think the biggest thing they need to assess, and Max Verstappen is the real blocker in this, and it's a pretty hefty blocker to have, is, as you've already mentioned, Ben, how do they work out the setup, the development of the car to take a small percentage of what Max Verstappen is able to do and balance that so that second driver is actually able to produce consistent, solid performances? Because clearly that car and the way Max Verstappen drives is built in such a fundamentally unique manner that it does not complement many other drivers in their driving style. So for me, that's what they need to learn. They need to go and assess that. And I suppose they need to ask themselves, do they care? Is it enough for them to take away performance from Max Verstappen and give some to a second driver with how a car is developed? I don't know. But for me, that's probably the biggest changing point if they're going to make one where it should be made.
And as mentioned, we don't yet know what they're doing with the lineup. From Red Bull themselves, we'll know in due course. Of course, due course is a little bit vague. It might be tomorrow. It might be in a week's time. It might be after Christmas. But you can be assured that when we hear something about this, when it is confirmed, we'll give you our verdict on that. Just 1 day removed from the news that Sergio Perez will not be racing for Red Bull next season, turns out that Liam Lawson will be racing for Red Bull next season. He's been given the nod over Yuki Tsunoda. We're going to give our thoughts on that very shortly. Christian Horner obviously was asked about this today. Here's what he had to say. It was a very, very tight between the 2 of them. Yuki is a very fast driver. He's got 3 or 4 seasons of experience now. He did a very good job in the tyre test for us in Abu Dhabi, where the engineers were impressed with how he performed. With Liam, when you look and go into the analytics of his race pace, it was slightly better in the races than what Yuki Tsunoda was able to do. His qualifying pace was very close with Yuki, and you've got to assume that the potential with Liam is he's only going to get better and stronger. A couple of things have stood out with me for Liam. How versatile he is. You put him into a situation, he gets on with it. If you remember his debut in Zandvoort after Daniel broke his fingers, he was racing against Max on his outlap. He did also say it is great to have Yuki still involved with the Racing Bull scene next year. That's a direct quote, and I hate it. And of course, he's on standby should he ever be required. Going to ask you this straight up, Sam, because Christian Horner did say it was a straight fight between Yuki Tsunoda and Liam Lawson. He's gone with Lawson. Would you have gone with Lawson?
Straight answer, no. I'm going Tsunoda. Ben, Lawson, Tsunoda, who would you have gone for?
Same as you. Yuki Tsunoda was the play. I'll explain why in a little bit, but I think given the experience difference between them, this was a play, this was an opportunity to get Tsunoda in that seat. And I am somewhat surprised that he's been overlooked again, based on how he's performed against teammates in the last 18 months or so. But hey, they apparently see something special in Liam Lawson. Christian Horner's comments are pretty evident of that. I'm surprised, but yeah, I'm with you. I'd have gone Tsunoda.
Yeah, I think for me, Tsunoda, since Gasly left the team and he started to come up against other teammates, has essentially been the yardstick, the measuring device for Red Bull to know who's good and who isn't. De Vries comes in, Tsunoda beats him. Ricciardo comes in, Tsunoda beats him. Lawson comes in for a first time, Tsunoda beats him. Ricciardo comes back in, Tsunoda beats him. Lawson comes in the second time, Tsunoda beats him. So Tsunoda is acting as this yardstick for Red Bull's measuring of who is and who isn't a good enough driver. But Tsunoda's almost seemingly to have to go up against an unknown goal at the end of the tunnel. It's like, oh yeah, can you run to the end of the tunnel for me? But the tunnel just keeps getting longer and longer and longer. You can't ever get to the end of it. And that's how it feels for Tsunoda. He's unable to achieve the goals set for him by Red Bull because there aren't any. Despite how well he's doing against so many very, very talented drivers, he never seems to be given this opportunity. Now, I want to make clear that this is not a diss at Liam Lawson. Liam Lawson is an incredibly talented driver. He did fantastic well at DTM. He did fantastic well in Super Formula. He has shown fantastic versatility when coming into Red Bull, the Red Bull driver program, of course, in the junior program. And the first time around, his performance in Zandvoort especially was phenomenal. He really was throwing in the deep end and he swam comfortably. But I just don't know what Yuki Tsunoda needs to do. And I'm sure Yuki has got to be looking anywhere he can for an exit now, because why would you commit any longevity, any more time in your career to a team that see you as simply like I said, a measuring stick, a yardstick of if anyone else is actually decent? What would it take for Yuki Tsunoda to actually get the step up, the leg up into that junior, into the senior team rather, and to actually get the chance at race wins, at doing well? I don't think they've got any intentions to ever put him in that team now. It seems that the style that Lawson presents is what they want, and that's fine, but it's very disappointing for Yuki Tsunoda, who has dedicated so much time to that Red Bull family.
Throughout the course of today, this was announced early morning here, UK time, so we've had an opportunity to see the fallout of this decision, where people are landing on it. And I've seen a lot of people tiptoe around this one, suggesting that maybe Red Bull got it wrong and that it should have been Yuki Tsunoda. I ain't going to tiptoe around this. I think it was an awful decision by Red Bull. I think it was an awful decision. And that's not against Liam Lawson. That's just based on the logic of putting Tsunoda in that seat. Because at what point do you just have to do something with Yuki Tsunoda? Like, you either have to give him a shot or let him go. This was the perfect opportunity to just give it a trial. Why have you kept him in that seat for so many years, to be presented with a golden opportunity to let him show you what he can do, to then pass him over? Liam Lawson wasn't going anywhere. Lawson could have had a full season in that junior program, and they've declined that. I said it earlier, a couple of months ago, as part of a discussion, that putting Yuki Tsunoda in the seat for 2025 does give you options going into 2026, because if Yuki Tsunoda does a great job, then okay, that's probably the best case scenario. You don't have to do anything. You can just keep with Tsunoda, and that's a great lineup. If he doesn't live up to your expectations, then you've got the option of either Lawson or Hadjar, depending on who impresses more next season in that junior program. Or worst case scenario, all three of them don't live up to your expectations, at which point you look elsewhere. But at least going into 2026, you would have these different options. I don't see it. Lawson is going into, Lawson's going into next season, and if he doesn't do very well, and that remains to be seen, it's been a tough gig being Verstappen's teammate. Then what happens? They're clearly not sold on Tsunoda, so they're not going to promote him at this point. What do you do with Lawson? Do you keep going? Do you put him back to the junior program? I don't think this is the way it should have been handled. And again, it's not really on Lawson. I think given he's only had 11 race starts, he's done a good job. But the point is, he's had 11 race starts.
Yeah, Lawson is almost, non-culpable in this situation. He could put his hands up and go, I was just doing the best that I could. I was new to the sport. I'm doing what I can. It's not really on me that I've been picked by Red Bull here. It's Red Bull making another rash decision where they've tried to go risky. They've tried to pull something out of the bag to impress people. And they haven't learned from their mistakes. They got rid of Albon too quickly. They got rid of Gasly too quickly. They kept Perez for too long. And now they've jumped a driver that has taken the time to prove themselves. Lawson, I'm sure, will acclimatise. I'm sure he will do a good job. I hope he does a good job because
I'm not convinced.
No, we don't know. All I know is he is a very talented young man. I want him to succeed. It's about time that Red Bull get a driver lineup that can compete on both sides of the garage. He gets the time to do so. And I wish him well. I really do. But it is a shame for Yuki. The interesting question, of course, is that Red Bull family, in terms of their power units, are moving to Ford, of course. And a key part of Yuki's contract in line with that Red Bull family is that he was a Honda spec driver. Do you think that's got anything to do with it, Ben? Do you think that maybe he's going to be looking for a way out with that Aston Martin link in a couple of years' time? Or do you think it's completely irrelevant?
I think that it's a large part of the reason why he's there to begin with, but equally, if you give him the opportunity to succeed and he stands out as a driver in his own right, I think at that point, the Honda deal does become irrelevant, because at that point, you just have a driver that's good enough to be in the spot. I think they just think that Lawson has got the better potential of the two, which, fair enough, but I don't think the Honda thing does come into it. Red Bull have failed. Red Bull have utterly failed in their quest. They have massive amount of resources in that they have two whole teams to play with. And you're right, they got stuck in a situation where after Ricciardo left, and it all goes back to that point. I know it happened 6 years ago, but everything stems from the point of Ricciardo leaving. They promote Gasly too early, and it doesn't work out. Their answer to promoting someone too early is to promote someone else even earlier in Alex Albon. Albon had only done 12 races before he was put in the Red Bull seat. That doesn't work. They then go out and get Sergio Perez as an outside hire, which I understood at that point. But surely as soon as you sign Sergio Perez, nearly 4 years ago to the day, at that point, you're thinking of your succession plan. We had to do something that as a team, we don't like to do. We had to go outside of our program to find someone. That is an indictment of what we've done or not done. That is a failure on us. At that point, it should have been building the next star. And yet, 4 years down the line, what have we got? The same situation. Lawson's done 11 races in RB, and he's being promoted. It's the same situation as Alex Albon entirely. It's 4 years. There's no progress.
I think the same could be shown that it reflects in almost the exact same pattern in the junior team as well. The fact that that's meant to be their building block, and you talk about how Ricciardo left and you had that series of step-ups. Well, Gasly, of course, goes back to AlphaTauri at the time. He leaves AlphaTauri for Alpine. What's their solution? They haven't got a young driver ready to promote. They haven't got someone within their program to look to. So they fail on that progress. They go outside. They pick Nick De Vries, of all people, who had one positive experience. One. That is the time, if any scientific experiment happened and you had one moment of data to analyze, you would go, this isn't viable. We can't really extract anything positive or negative out of this. You need more data to understand. Is it an outlier? Is it a variable? Is this the consistent data? You don't know. And it was proven that one moment of positive was completely the outlier, completely wrong. And they failed. So they have to get rid of Nick De Vries. Who do they bring back? The driver they essentially lost 4 or 5 years ago at that point. And then that doesn't work out. And then Yuki Tsunoda beats them all continually. And now Lawson, as you've mentioned, has been promoted arguably too soon. Again, as I've said it, I really hope he defies the Red Bull pattern. I really hope he gets into that car and he is immediately up there with the rivals that Red Bull have. And he is successful, because There's no one I don't want to see anyone struggle through that Red Bull program, because there have been a lot of broken drivers that have taken years to recover. They've had their confidence ruined, and they're talented. Look at Gasly. Look at Albon. Look at Tsunoda now. They are very talented drivers. If Lawson doesn't thrive almost immediately, by that summer break, I would argue, there's a chance that he could be crushed by that system, and he's just another one, another page in the book of Red Bull failures. And then where do they go? Do they promote Hadjar? Because they're not going to promote Tsunoda. Why would he even take it? Why would he even trust that family at this point? They have shot themselves in the foot because they've gone with an option that realistically doesn't make sense based on their own development program.
And I'm so happy to be wrong on this, by the way. I would encourage you in 12 months' time, if Lawson does a great job, please come back to this clip, come back to this episode and tell me, Ben, you were a moron and you were wrong. Because at that point, it would be a success story for Lawson, and I'm happy to take the L. But I just don't have the confidence that, based on the development or lack of development Lawson has been able to show at this point. Again, it's not a knock on Lawson, it's a knock on how much time he's been given. And the Nick De Vries point is a very important one, because they could have had Lawson instead of De Vries at that point in time. We would be sat here now with Lawson having done 2 full seasons, 46 races rather than 11, and we would have a far more confident outlook on whether he's good enough to be in that seat or not. If he had joined at the beginning of last season and he had, let's say, been on a par with Tsunoda last year and had been slightly better than him for the full season this year, I would at that point say, yes, Lawson has definitely done enough. I would say the sweet spot for these RB2 Red Bull promotions are somewhere between 18 months and maybe 3 years at a max in that junior team. And all we've had to this point is either half a season, or an outside hire. We haven't had the natural progression of a driver from that junior program to the main program where the timing has felt right in forever. So again, not a knock on Lawson. It's just they should have put him in the seat way earlier than what they did.
What do you think happens to the junior team if Lawson is phenomenal and they have Max Verstappen and Lawson for the next 8, 10 years? What's the point? They won't promote anyone. There's no space for them.
I think you always have to work on the pessimistic, I know, but you have to work on the worst case scenario of either of them could leave at any one point. Even if the reality does end up being something like that, you never know when a Daniel Ricciardo situation might come around. And that, again, that's ultimately what's kickstarted all of this, is Daniel Ricciardo unexpectedly leaving in 2018. And if they knew at that point what was going to happen, they could have worked on a succession plan, and we wouldn't be here discussing what has gone wrong for them over the last 5 years with that second seat. So I still think, if Lawson does end up being as good as they hope he will be, Hadjar, who would be, and it's to be clear, it's not been confirmed at this point that he will be in that second seat alongside Tsunoda, but it's highly likely. He would be a rookie next season, of course, so he would be comfortable in that seat for a couple of years at a minimum. You wouldn't need to rush through anything for him. Tsunoda, if then he did leave at the end of next season, you've got the opportunity to put another rookie in for 2026. I've mentioned the name of Arvid Lindblad a few times. I think he is likely to make F1. So you've then got a few years to, not necessarily promote someone, but yeah, I think you at least have to prepare for you won't have a long-term lineup, just in case it does go wrong.
Yeah, fair point. All right, well, folks, listen, let us know your thoughts on this move. Are you Yuki? Are you Lawson? Do you think it's fair that Lawson got that call up? Do you think it should have been Yuki and Lawson needs more time? Really interested to know what your thoughts are on that Red Bull driver lineup right now.